Jodi is tuning in from UC Berkely today. She comes to us from British Columbia, Canada originally, where many of you may know that a massive mountain pine beetle outbreak affected over 10 million hectares of the province in the 2000s. Since coming to California just over a year ago, Jodi has focused her extension activities on drought and bark beetle-driven mortality across the state. She's participating on the Governor's Tree Mortality Task Force and doing extension work in the Sierra Nevada. And these experiences provided Dr. Axelson an opportunity to see the extensive tree mortality firsthand and to identify existing knowledge gaps. In the past summer, Jodi has started 2 research projects. One is focused on quantifying different ecosystem elements of the mortality event along a south to north transect in the Sierra Nevada. And the other one is using drones to determine if early detection of bark beetle infestations is possible. So I feel lucky that I was able to wrangle Jodi for this webinar and sort of allow her schedule to fit with ours during her field work. So I feel really excited to introduce her today, and I am going to turn it over to her. So I'll put those links in the chat pod and give her your attention. Thank you.
Thank you for joining, and I am sitting here in sunny, cool Berkeley, California, and excited to talk about bark beetles. I'm going to talk about bark beetle outbreaks across Western North America, and talk a little bit about the causes, why these insects have outbreaks, some of the control, and what are the consequences of these, what can often be very large landscape level events. Right from the beginning, I want to say that there is a wonderful breadth of research on this topic, and so I'm synthesizing a lot of what other people have done on this topic. And in the end, we'll talk a little bit about some of the work I'm writing up right now on mountain pine beetle outbreaks in Alberta. This is just a fairly brief list of some native bark beetles in Western North America that are capable of having large landscape level outbreaks. There's a lot on the list that are active in the forests sort of all of the time and either an endemic situation, but these are the ones we kind of know really well. Mountain pine beetle. This is a beetle that's been in the news a lot between outbreaks in British Columbia, Montana, Idaho, Colorado, as well as spruce beetle. These 2 are kind of the big eruptive beetles that we really think about impacting just enormous amounts of the landscape. As we can see on the the right-hand side of this table, we sort of have some of their hosts, so some of the common hosts of these insects. So mountain pine beetle sort of is the largest generalist of this group in many ways, in that it attacks many different types of pine trees. Luckily, through Barbara Bentz's recent work, we know that bristlecone pine is not a suitable host for mountain pine beetle, which is great news, given this is the longest lived tree on the planet. Spruce beetle going after different spruces. Western pine beetle has been getting a lot of attention in California due to a fairly large outbreak of this insect, and it's quite targeted on ponderosa pine and coulter pines. And then, of course, we have the different ips that are affecting more of our more desert southwest regions of the West, pine engravers, and fir beetle down at the bottom, Ascolitis. So all of these beetles can have population sort of eruptions and impact fairly large areas on the landscape. And this is sort of how we think about bark beetles. This is often how they are portrayed in the media. This is from a Mother Jones article. We don't notice bark beetles until there's a lot of dead trees, basically. And so I thought this was sort of a funny way to introduce bark beetles. So bark beetles are natural thinning agents. The insects that I'm talking about in today's talk are native bark beetles. And so they've been having outbreaks for millennia. There's some really interesting lake core work that shows actual beetle fragments preserved in the sediment record from 8,000 years ago. This is Andrea Brunel and others' work. And so, this photo sort of shows this thinning opportunity that beetles can create. They have this preference for larger trees. So they're taking out those large trees from the landscape, and they create gaps. And within those gaps, maybe you get release of existing trees that are into understory, or you get kind of a regeneration pulse. Bark beetles, of course, from that last slide we saw, are very host specific as well. So they're only targeting, their preferred size and their preferred hosts. And so I think it's good to try to think about beetles as a holistic and natural part of the environment. There is an except, and that except is when they outbreak, they can impact an enormous amount of land area. So this is an example of a photograph taken over British Columbia during the mountain pine beetle outbreak that started in the late 1990s and, just sort of ended in the late 2000s, early 2010 time period. This impacted over 10 million hectares of land area. And so for folks who think in acres, that's over 25 million acres. So that's a really large outbreak. In the upper right-hand corner, what we're seeing, upper left, is the amount of area affected by the mountain pine beetle in British Columbia since we started to do record keeping. And so we see, the 1930s is this tiny blip, some activity in the 1950s. The 1970s, we start to see a larger outbreak, and by that 1990s and 2000s outbreak, it just skyrockets. And so this ends up being an extremely significant impact to the economy and the ecology of British Columbia. And so I think that's why we think about bark beetles a little bit like this, because this can happen when you get a very eruptive population dynamic and the right ecological condition. And so let's talk a little bit about why outbreaks happen. This is from Ken Raffa's work, and it's a really complicated diagram, and it speaks to the complicated nature of bark beetle outbreaks. So what we see here on the far left of this schematic are the different thresholds. So there's different sequence of thresholds that must be crossed in order for there to be establishment of an outbreak, and that results in this sort of landscape level eruption. This middle column speaks to the endogenous controls within the system. So these are the internal controls on the likelihood of beetles surpassing a particular threshold. And so at the top here we see bark beetle biology, we see the local density, the actual nature of the tree, so the phloem thickness, microbial symbionts, and then you go down, and so these are all things that are impacting the ability for this sort of thing to happen, stand to landscape level eruptions. And on the far right, we have exogenous controls in the system. So these are outside controls and things that can release the bark beetle biology. So drought, biotic stresses on the host. This is a really big one, and this is a really big one in California. I'll speak about that in a little while. Temperature also plays a huge role. We see this especially in boreal and high elevation systems. Geophysical barriers. This is an interesting one because, as far as we knew, mountain pine beetle had never outbreaked in the Canadian Northern Rocky Mountains. We'd known that they had outbreaks in the Southern Rocky Mountains on the Montana-Idaho border, but they'd never been farther north. This last mountain pine beetle outbreak, they surpassed this geophysical barrier of the Canadian Rocky Mountains and are now in what Alan Carroll refers to as sort of a naive host. They're in a stand of lodgepole jack pine segues across the entire boreal. In a group of trees that aren't kind of co-evolved to deal with this insect. And so perhaps we get this regime shift. This is just a brand new paper by Rupert Seidel and others. And it's a really interesting piece of work because what they did is they took papers from 1990 onwards, and they analyzed over 670 papers for all of these different disturbance types. And what they did is they quantified, based on all of this meta-analysis, to what extent different disturbances are driven by direct effects, so climate. So these are the unmediated impacts of climate on a disturbance process. The indirect effects up here, which describe how climate may influence disturbances through effects on the vegetation or on some other process. And then below, this interaction effect, which really refers to the disturbance of interest being influenced by other disturbance agents. And so cumulatively across all of these different disturbance types, climate at 57% was sort of responsible for the different disturbances. So the width of this arrow shows its relative importance for these different disturbances. And so a lot of these, drought, not surprisingly, is driven directly by climate. Fire, very strong effect of climate. Disease, also a very strong effect. When we get to insects, it's really a mix. You know, we have roughly 30% is an indirect effect, 30% is a climatic effect, and the biggest, the thickest arrow, but not by a lot, is this interaction effect. So around 41% of disturbances driven by an interaction of some level of climate and potentially other disturbance. So this is an interesting way to look at how insects fit in with this sort of this grand scheme of other disturbances that operate on our landscapes. This figure is from Nate McDowell and others, and this paper was a big deal because we started to see, people started to think about global scale tree mortality dieback events. And so that top figure, all those dots are showing where documented mortality has been associated with droughts since the 1970s. And then this bottom figure is actually adapted from the work that Rafa did that I showed you earlier, that's showing eruptions of spruce beetle, mountain pine beetle, and pinyon ips throughout the western US and Canada. And so mountain pine beetle is in red, spruce beetle in green. These graphs here are showing us the cumulative amount of area that's being impacted by these insects from 1998 onward. And together, they impacted 47 million hectares of area, which is a really enormous amount. The red lines in these diagrams are showing that the time period during which these insects were active, that it's the proportion of the outbreak period that was significantly related to climate deviations. So in this case, they looked at 30-year means of climate, and we're primarily looking at summer temperature anomalies and percentage of spring rain. And so we see for the building period of these two insects, spruce beetle and mountain pine beetle, they're very much, as these populations increase, they're very much related to sort of these climatic anomalies. But at some point, when that line turns black, they are no longer being influenced by a climatic anomaly. So we can think about this as sort of climate was sort of an inciting factor that allowed these populations to build. But once they were very high, there was no longer kind of these departures from normal conditions. So they're released from climate, and so they just keep going. I often make the analogy that sometimes these dendroctonus, specifically outbreaks, feel like a little bit like a runaway train. And so climate's not stopping them at this point. And so it's some other thing that creates that crash. Pinyon nips is interesting because during this period here that they have this area impacted by pinyon nips, it's always in a period of climatic anomaly. And so pinyon nips potentially is more of a flashy outbreak. The insect is never really released from that climatic stress period. And my last year in California and seeing how hard the western pine beetle is crashing, I'm starting to think that probably western pine beetle looks a lot like this, at least in California. This, to mainly follow on with the pinyon nips example, is work that Connie Millar and Nate Stevenson presented. It's actually a figure adapted from work by Park Williams. And so what we're going to see, I'll set up these graphs for you, is on this right-hand axis is a forest drought stress index. And so what this index integrates is the effects of warm season water deficit And this is mainly being controlled by high temperatures and cold season precipitation. So as the numbers for this index go negative, it's becoming drier, more sort of a greater forest drought stress. On the left here, we have different things. And so on the top, I'll just walk through, starting from the top all the way to the bottom. We have the normalized difference of vegetation index. This is a remotely sensed index of greenness. And so from our bottom axis here, 1980 to 2015, we see greenness decreasing in the southwestern states. And we also see this increasing by this negative number, increasing forest drought stress. If we look at the next one, this is the percentage of trees that are dead. So you have pinyon pine, ponderosa pine in blue, and Douglas fir in green. Now, they flipped the forest drought severity index for the rest of these graphs, and that's sort of just to facilitate recognizing the patterns. So as drought stress has increased, this red line, it's now a 6-year smooth line. We see this coinciding pattern of mortality in these different species centered around the late 2000s. For bark beetle area, we see this quite strong relationship between the amount of kilometer squared area in this golden line over time and the increased in drought severity. Again, now it's a 2-year smooth line. And then wildfire area. So as your area of wildfire increases, so is the forest drought severity index. So this kind of shows quite nicely these relationships, this sort of interactive relationship that the meta-analysis presented earlier showed. Now I arrived to a really big drought in California. So I got here last year and, there was just this incredible drought. And it started in roughly 2011, 2012. This is work by Greg Asner, where, at the Carnegie Institute, they've been able to fly over the entire state and used some very high-tech stuff to derive this canopy water stress metric. And so this is progressive canopy water stress over the 2011 to 2015 period. The hotter the color, the higher the water stress, right? And so canopy water content is sort of the total amount of liquid water in the canopy, and it's an indicator of not only drought stress, but vegetation flammability, and maybe, the potential for some of these trees to die. These big black blobs are fires, so they completely excluded that from the analysis. So we get this picture of cumulative drought stress within the state of California. And we can look at how this drought stress impacts western, this is bark beetle mortality in total, so mountain pine beetle, Ips, western pine beetle. But what we know from this last event is a lot of the damage, a lot of the mortality was concentrated in the ponderosa pine. So this is data from the Forest Health Protection Aerial Survey Program. And so on this left axis, we see the percentage of the flown area with mortality. So 0 to 16, and these are those red bars. What we see on the right axis in this blue line is precipitation departure. So taking the full amount of precipitation from October to September, so that's considered the water year, and the degree of deviation from the long-term 20th century average. So anything above this dashed 0 line is a wet period, and anything below this line is a dry period. And so here's this El Nino event in 1997, 98. That was quite a large event. And what this graph is really pointing out is that during these wet periods, the bark beetle mortality is very low in the state of California. And that as we start to see these departures from the long-term average in terms of a drying effect, we see these peaks in bark beetles. This 2003 through 2005 was a western pine beetle outbreak concentrated in the San Bernardino Mountains that crashed quite quickly. But that population actually stayed quite elevated through the rest of the 2000s as we sort of climatically shifted between this wetter through drier period. And then here in 2000, starting in 2012, we see this strong departure from normal, the largest departure from normal in this record. And what we also know from tree ring records, so work by Dan Griffin and Kevin Anchikaitis, is this drought was, the worst drought in the last 1,200 years. As we see this negative anomaly, we really start to see the bark beetle numbers increase, in that mortality increase. And so this really shows nicely that disturbance interaction in this dry Mediterranean climate with drought. And so control. And control is a topic people have really varying opinions about. And, Barb Bentz has stated and written that there is no way to control a bark beetle outbreak once it is a landscape scale event. And I completely agree with that. But when we try to control insects, whether they're bark beetles or whether they're defoliators, we never do so thinking we're going to eradicate the pest. My previous job, I worked with the BC Forest Service, and we were having a 20-year outbreak of the western spruce budworm, which is a native defoliator across the range of Douglas fir. And so we would treat that insect, never with the intent of eradicating the insect, but trying to minimize the damage. And, the efficacy studies we could do, the monitoring we could do following those treatments demonstrated a nice decrease in the local population. And so I just wanted to make that sort of caveat statement that when I'm talking about control, I'm talking about at the very low levels of an outbreak, or before an outbreak's even begun, right? Just when you start to notice that mortality, that's when I believe we can have an impact. I really like this table I've adapted from Justin DeRose and Long's work around resistance and resilience. And what they really do is they take a rich literature on these subjects and they apply it to silviculture. And so what they mean when they say resistance in this paper is that these two different scales, the stand scale and the landscape scale, resistance is how the structure and composition of a stand impacts the level of either mortality at that stand scale or the transition from endemic, so a very low population, to a high population. So the way that the landscape sets up this disturbance to occur. The way they refer to resilience is what happened after the disturbance. So it's the idea that it's the influence of the disturbance on the subsequent structure. So it says it right here. So a system is resilient when there's still trees, or maybe there's still large live host trees, so trees that would have been susceptible to, in the case of this paper, they're talking specifically about fire and spruce beetle. And then again, these are very similar, but you scale this up to the landscape proportion. And so they're different concepts, but I think they're interesting moving forward, because one of the direct control options that we have is to modify the stand. This may reduce, this might change the way a disturbance can propagate on the landscape, and it may change the outcome after the disturbance has passed. I've started looking at these old historical images taken around California, mainly in the 30s and 40s, and they're a wonderful peek back into time. And so one of the direct things we can do on the landscape is to change forest structure. And so the work of Malcolm North and Eric Knapp and others at the Pacific Research Centers with the U.S. Forest Service have shown us historically that the landscape was a lot more clumpy and gappy. And this is particularly true of the Sierra Nevada, where you have mixed conifer types and a lot of very dramatic elevation. This is probably less true in areas of the central interior of British Columbia that are really sort of fire-driven systems, where you get a lot of lodgepole pond and maybe parts of Montana. But you know what this photograph points toward is there is heterogeneity in this stand. And we've lost a lot of that heterogeneity. We hear over and over again the role that fire suppression has played in not only densifying our forests, but also creating more homogeneity. So in this picture, what I see, and for scale here, is a car and a person standing beside this massive ponderosa pine. As we see a range of species, a range of sizes, there's obviously a large gap here, and this is why all this regeneration has established. And so I think we need to look at moving our landscapes toward not restoration, not trying to recreate the past, but creating some heterogeneity, not only in the species, but the age structures. Bark beetles, especially dendroctonous bark beetles, go after the larger trees. And that's largely a function of the phloem thickness, right? And so if a bark beetle was to wipe through this stand, all of these smaller trees would be largely untouched. The incense cedar would not be attacked. The sugar pine, if it was a western pine beetle, would not be attacked. And so there would be a lot of residual structure after an event like this. This is the last I'll show of a historical photo, but this is also an example of, I deleted it from the caption because all of these photos have caption, but this one says poorly stocked. What I find funny about that is, obviously this was a forest inventory and that's why these images were taken. But this is ponderosa pine, sugar pine, and black oak type. And this is probably the density at which all of those species can exist on the landscape. And it certainly does not look like that now. And so I think the larger thing we need to look at across the Intermountain West, in both Canada and the US, is how do we help forest structures, the structure and the composition, how to have it exist in a way, what we can do to modify it so that it is more resistant to disturbance, so we don't set up necessarily these large outbreaks, although large outbreaks are likely going to happen at some point anyways, and are they going to be resilient? And again, this idea isn't universally accepted either, because there's this idea that there's climate adaptation, and who are we to say what are the trees to take out and the trees to leave? Nature does this for us, and for sure through bark beetle outbreaks, nature does do this for us. I'm now going to talk about some of the direct mechanisms we can do to, and again, control was the wrong word probably. It's a nice alliteration. It's mainly mitigate. It's mainly to minimize damage by these insects. And so this is an example of the most southeastern corner of British Columbia. And the idea with sanitation harvests, sort of the beginning of an integrated pest management strategy, is you maximize the extraction of currently infested trees to reduce the damage and minimize the spread. And this is at the scale we're talking about. We're at the stand to the landscape scale. In British Columbia, we have a thing called bark beetle management unit. So it's quite hard to see, but all these little faint gray lines are indicating a type of about a bark beetle management unit. And depending on the susceptibility rating, what your insect populations are, followed up by ground monitoring, your ability to treat the insect, you come up with these different strategies. So the darkest green color is the suppression strategy. And the strategy there is really to remove at least a minimum of 80% of infested material. And this is to try to minimize the spread. And then as you move through these colors, you have monitor. So these are areas of the landscape that have very low risk of in this case, mountain pine beetle impacting the area. So it's just a monitor. And often with bark beetles, that runaway train effect happens. You get very high mortality and you're not stopping it. You're in a salvage situation at that point.
Jodi, I have a quick question for you. When you say the technique there is just removing the affected trees, what technique are they using to remove? Is it just felling the trees and actually physically removing them, or chipping them, or what are they doing?
Yeah, it is. It is removing them through harvesting practices. So in salvaging, the trees are dead, the beetles have flown, right? And this is the classic thing: is people don't tend to notice bark beetles until the trees are red. Well, by that time, the trees are dead, and the bark beetle has flown away. So there is no forest health benefit to removing those trees. When we're doing suppression activities, we are taking currently infested trees that still have live beetles in them. So they haven't finished their life cycle, and we are felling them. They could be chipped, they could be debarked, they could be taken to mills where they're debarked, and effectively the bark beetles are destroyed. Region 8 in the US Southeast does this with southern pine beetle. It's very effective. It can be very effective. Now, southern pine beetle biology is a little different. As soon as you fall those trees, you arrest the development of the beetle. In the western states, spruce beetle, mountain pine beetle, western pine beetle, simply falling the tree isn't going to arrest the development of the beetle necessarily. So then you need to deal with it. So it either needs to be milled, chipped, burned, and whatnot. As also part of this strategy, I would say having trap trees where you fall down a healthy green tree and that brings in the beetles, and then you get rid of that tree, is also sort of what I think of as suppression tactic. The requirements of using this is the infestation size. You have to be able to meet that 80% target, or there really is no point. You know, Alan Carroll's work has shown that. A very extensive review of the literature Diana Six did has shown that. Timing is critical. Once the beetles are flown, you are doing salvage. You are not helping forest health per se. That's getting blocked. Harvesting practices and debris management. So these are really essential pieces of a suppression tactic. Then we move on through that kind of that integrated pest management spectrum to using pheromones, so manipulating the bark beetle. And so there are pheromones that can either attract, and I've highlighted the word repel bark beetles. And I highlight repel because that's often what we're trying to do. It's generally only timber management companies that may want to attract the beetle because they already have a timber harvest planned. And so we're trying to repel the bark beetle. And so this can be effective at the stand or to the individual tree scale. And so what we're seeing on the far left is the application of a verbenome in a splat formulation. And so this was a nice adaptation of what we normally thought of as the pouches, this timed release synthetic pheromone. It's being applied using just a regular caulking gun and being applied directly to the bole of the tree. Now, what's really important with pheromones is not all pheromones work equally across different bark beetles. And I think people always want to try to save their trees and they want to try to do something. And we need to be aware as professionals, especially people in the urban landscape, that we should not be selling people things that will not work. And so verbenone works for mountain pine beetle. Verbenone plus has some demonstrated ability to inhibit western pine beetle, but the studies are sort of, the jury's out on that one. Sometimes it's shown to be effective and sometimes it's not. And so these are really important to keep in mind. This is a very nice publication that talks about pheromone protection for trees. This photo accompanied the webinar advertisement. I think it's kind of funny just because, mostly because I'm wearing cork boots in a dry fir forest, but I was putting up MCH. And this was a really good candidate stand. We had low levels of Douglas fir bark beetle. We were stapling up MCH pouches on this sort of isolated population. And so we've seen some nice demonstrated efficacy on that, again, at a low population level. And then finally, we have protection of individual trees. And this is for homeowners that have a beautiful tree they definitely don't want to lose. This is, or a campsite that has a tree they definitely don't want to use. These are applied at the individual tree level and they are expensive. And so you have sprays, so they could be either carbaryl or pyrethroid-based sprays, and you'll get a number of years, 1 to 2, maybe 3 of protection based on those. And then this new technology, which are injectables. The nice thing about some of the injectables is you have much less target effect, non-target effect. So impacting insects other than the ones that are boring into that tree. And so emamectin benzoate is an example. So triage, I think, is one of the commercial chemical names. And so this is where you are putting in these sort of almost like a needle, and you're pressurizing the product into the tree. Now, the timing, again, is really important with this. So for mountain vine beetle and spruce beetle, this only works in the fall when that tree is translocating, and the year before they would actually be challenged by a bark beetle. And western pine beetles, some studies by Grossman and others have shown you can get up to 3 years of protection. So in California, this would need to be done very early in the spring when trees are actually actively translocating up to their crowns, because they are more than likely shutting down in the wintertime or in the summertime when it gets so extremely dry. So Chris Fettig and others have done a lot of work on this, and this is again a single tree treatment, but it is expensive. So you're going to be doing this at low numbers on your property. And so the consequences. And this is where my own research area falls into, actually, is when I worked with the Canadian Forest Service, Renee Alfaro, and in my PhD, I was looking at what happens during and or after large outbreaks of different insects. So for bark beetles, we can really think about in the short term, you have tree mortality, obviously. Those trees eventually fall down, so you have fuel loading. That word is grayed out because I think that's an entirely separate topic. You could do a whole webinar on the implications of fuel loads from bark beetle outbreaks. And then you have something that happens after. You have Renee Alfaro actually coined this term, so I should give him credit. Life after beetle. Maybe we need to think about life with beetle. Maybe we won't be living in a beetle-free world too much anymore. So I've looked at a large number of studies, and there's really 3 main recovery trajectories after bark beetle. And so you could have regeneration and, in a forestry term, adequate stocking of the species that was lost. So in this case, this is central British Columbia on the left, and this is showing a pine forest that is staying to pine. And so pine keeps regenerating after successive bark beetle outbreaks. You can have a succession towards different shade tolerant species, and so that's occurring here on the right, where we're seeing spruce come up in the understory. And in the Rocky Mountain states and high elevation sites, an increase in aspen potentially. And so these little outcomes are really, really largely dependent on the initial forest structures and composition before the outbreak, the soil substrate and moisture conditions. So some species require a bare mineral soil to regenerate on. Pines and aspens are good examples. This is a special place in British Columbia. Actually, a lot of wildfires have been burning through this part of the central interior, the Chilcotin and the Caribou, and you have very thin soils. You actually have bare mineral soil. This is probably why pine does so well. And the degree of the mortality that's actually occurred. So this is going to dictate how much canopy opening you get, and how much light is going to come in, how much residual basal area you have in a stand. Just to wrap up, I'm going to show you some work I'm preparing right now. And this is sort of one of these nice longitudinal studies that somebody decided to start in the 1980s. So Waterton Lakes National Park is in the far southwestern corner of Alberta, and it borders Glacier National Park in Montana. Very deeply dissected landscapes of Rocky Mountain peaks, and then these lower elevation forests that are mainly dominated by pine. In the late 1970s and early 80s, there was a mountain pine beetle outbreak in this park, and being a national park, nothing was done. So it gave us an opportunity to see a long-term trajectory of recovery. And so the study was initiated by a CFS scientist in the 80s, and they were primarily interested in quantifying the degree of overstory mortality. And so that gray bar, the light gray bar, is showing us the amount of trees that died in each of these 5 stands that were studied, with trees per hectare on this axis, and then the amount of trees that remained alive. So we see, over a fairly small area at these low elevation stands, a great amount of variety in the amount of trees that died. And those red arrows are going to be trees I'm going to stands, I'm going to show what happened. This is our low mortality site. And so we only had 10% overstory mortality. Before the outbreak, so we took all the trees that had been recorded as dead by mountain pine beetle or IPS in 1981 when these stands were first measured, and we made them alive again. So we could see what the pre-outbreak condition looked like. This red color is lodgepole pine, and now our trees per hectare are on this x-axis. And so here's a stand dominated by pine that suffers a very minor amount of overstory mortality. And as time goes on, so through these different remeasurement periods, we start to see an increase in some of the other species present. So interior spruce in dark blue, and Douglas fir and subalpine fir in these green and teal colors. Now, the original scientists never thought to look at the understory, but Brad Hawks, who revisited this site with Renee Alfaro in the 2000s, was interested in this idea of what was happening in the understory. So we have saplings and we have regeneration. So the really little trees are the regeneration, the saplings are something that you can actually measure a breast height on, even if it's really small. And what we see is in 2002 and 10, at these different measurement periods, you have very low levels of saplings present in the stand. This is likely because the canopy didn't open up that much. And then regeneration is almost entirely subalpine fir. You know, this layer dies off a lot, so there's a lot less in 2010. In our intermediate mortality, the colors stay the same throughout all of these stands. So here we have nearly 30% overstory mortality. In the overstory, there always was a mix at this particular stand. Even before the outbreak, there was poplar, aspen, spruce, and very little bits of subalpine fir. In our understory, we have a much higher number compared to the last stand. So 1,600 trees per hectare in 2010 of saplings, and they're almost all poplar. And that's interesting. In the regeneration layer, again, we're seeing this complete conversion. And so this is, of those kind of outcomes I presented, this is a kind of a combination of the two. We're seeing increased aspen, and we're seeing a succession towards shade-tolerant species. This is our high mortality. So this stand had over 93%, or had around 93% trees killed by the outbreak. So we see this massive reduction in the pine component. Again, this was always a mixed species stand, and it was also our stand with the lowest amount of starting density. In the sapling layer, you see a little bit of pine, so it's probably open enough that we're seeing some pine in that layer, but we're not seeing it in the regeneration layer because the seed bed is probably incorrect. That soil substrate isn't adequate. And so we have this sort of mix of, again, poplar, aspen, subalpine fir, and all those little tiny babies coming up. They are mostly subalpine fir. So that's sort of, that study gives us, over that 30-year period, gives us some sense of the long-term impacts of bark beetle outbreaks. And really those are increased stand heterogeneity. By being so excellent at fire suppression, we have really created much more homogeneous landscapes that can be quite susceptible to bark beetle outbreaks. In this case, you know, in the Waterton case, perhaps there's a decreased susceptibility to there being a large mountain pine beetle outbreak in the future because now that host has been reduced. And some of the work by Sarah Hart in the Southern Rocky Mountains has showed this dampening effect. So 1940 spruce beetle outbreaks, there was enough mortality and enough increased heterogeneity in the stands that there was actually this decreased susceptibility to future outbreaks. And Renee Alfaro and Lara Van Acker and others at the Canadian Forest Service have shown the same in central British Columbia to mountain pine beetle. So between this increased heterogeneity and this decreased susceptibility, maybe we start to get toward that resilience piece. And abruptly, that's it.
Thanks, Jodi. Feel free to stop sharing your screen and open the Q&A if you want, or else just keep sharing your screen and you can open the Q&A. I'm going to start reading off some of the questions that have popped up. And just a real quick one, Maria asked, is that single tree treatment, is it done yearly? that single tree when you had like the really expensive one, I think is what she's referring to.
Generally, the injectables are good for 2 to 3 years. So you can make that investment once. If you have very high beetle populations, you're noticing a lot of trees in your area that are dying, you might want to not push that 3rd year and do it every 2 years. But that has some demonstrated efficacy for a number of years.
Okay. You showed a diagram in the very beginning of your talk, which had the interaction, the indirect, and the climate, all of those components to outbreaks. And I was wondering, do you remember the author of that paper or the title? Because I wanted to look it up. It looked really interesting.
So that's Rupert Seidel. That just came out in 2017 in Nature Climate Change.
Okay.
Cool. It's fantastic work and really neat. There's such a breadth of literature to analyze it in that way.
Okay, good, thanks. Otis asked, does verbenone, I don't know how you say that, verbenone work for southern pine beetle?
I am not actually sure about that. There's some excellent U.S. Forest Service resources, and their publications are always free, that talk about IPM for southern pine beetle. I'm not exactly sure. I would have to defer to a colleague that works in that insect more. I don't think so. I think verbenone is specific to mountain pine beetle biology.
Okay. Maria asked, she believed that somebody she knew said Bayer made a chemical for the trees to get rid of various insects. Would this work for the bark beetle, or is that something you know about, you're familiar with?
I'm sure there's lots of chemicals on the landscape. I would look at getting an arborist in, preferably that has been referred to you by somebody that's dealt specifically with bark beetles, because they'll be able to point you to the products that will actually work. So triage is sort of a chemical name for one of the injectables. That's the amectin benzoate. That's a commercial formulation. But the research is really out still, whether verbenone or verbenone plus does a really good job of protecting trees from western pine beetles. So you have to be careful, and I think using professionals that you trust that have demonstrated experience with the bark beetle population of interest is important. Because, during these big outbreaks, people can sort of, promote products that aren't going to work. And then you've paid a lot of money for something that's not going to work anyway.
Okay. Any thoughts on biological controls for bark beetles?
Biological controls as in like mating? Well, the pheromones are kind of a form of biological control because you're using the beetle's own semiochemical biology to manipulate them. Bark beetles are very tricky. They defy landscape level treatments. They're feeding underneath the bark of trees. For defoliators, we can spray a stand with like a Bacillus thuringiensis, which is very targeted on that Lepidoptera that's chewing those needles. Bark beetles, there's nothing that direct. There's a lot of older work on mating disruption, and basically it didn't work for bark beetles. And should some of that work be reinvigorated, redone? Possibly, but
okay. Lou asked, in Oregon, we have been told that only ponderosa is really affected. Should urban foresters be looking to monitor Douglas fir for the beetle?
So in Oregon, different fir engravers are becoming, wood boring insects are becoming a problem for Douglas fir. So it's true, western pine beetle is not going to touch your Douglas firs. All of these beetles generally are very host specific. There is the Douglas fir beetle, which I left off the list. In British Columbia, this insect can be a real problem. In California, it's never a problem. In Oregon, it's somewhere in the middle. What I know from colleagues in Oregon, though, is that different fir wood borers are kind of cycling up in unexpected ways in response to droughty conditions and killing Douglas firs. That's what you should be looking for on the Douglas fir. They have very distinctive larvae, and I'm sure there's some really good extension materials out of particularly Oregon State University that would be targeted toward pests of Douglas fir.
Okay. David Coyle had a couple comments. I think he must be from the South. He said, maybe I missed it. Did Jodi, you mention if forest thinning can positively impact forest health, and whether can it help reduce mountain pine beetle infestations? This strategy works very well for southern pine beetle.
You know, I really believe that thinning has got to play a large role in the way we move forward with our forests. Southern pine beetle, it works so great. You know, there's sort of mixed results a little bit on mountain pine beetle. You know, different stands have called it, or studies have called it beetle proofing when you thin. And I wonder if it's really the fact that you've increased the vigor of the tree or you've changed the microsite conditions. But it has been demonstrated to have some level of efficacy. And I think what more importantly it does is it gets rid of this real density problem. You know, fires used to burn across the, you know, probably the entire continent, whether through Native American burning or lightning ignitions, pretty regularly, like anywhere from 8 to 20 years or 30 years in a lot of stands. A lot of these stands are 120 years out now with no fire disturbance. And this creates when fires start, very aggressive fire behavior. And it's, you know, this densification of forests. I think we need to be moving toward a thinner, less dense future across our forests in North America, because this Western pine beetle outbreak in California, its breadth has really demonstrated that a lot of the forests here are under stress and are not resilient. And I single out California because unlike some of the other states like Montana, Idaho, Colorado, it hasn't had really big outbreaks in the past that have like impacted a lot of area where the LA Times and the San Francisco Chronicle are writing about it constantly. This drought really triggered off a very large Western pine beetle outbreak, and I think the way to move toward a more resilient condition is through that long-term and direct approach, which is how can we impact the composition and the structure.
Otis said, knowing that southern pine beetle is not your specialty, what they're dealing with there in Georgia, could you recommend anything for southern pine beetle for more than a few trees on a homeowner's property where the sprays exceed the chemical allowance per acre?
So this is where you're going to really want to work probably with a registered professional forester. But, you know, the thing you can do for southern pine beetle is identify currently infested trees. So trees that aren't red, so they actually have bark beetles underneath them. And, you know, a lot of these dendroctonists have pretty obvious signals of when they've mass attacked a tree, like frass, so that's like little sawdust on the outside of the bark, or pitch tubes. These are kind of globular resin blobs the tree produces. And then you kind of hack into the bark. Is there live beetle under there? Is your tree still green and you got live beetle? Then you have a currently infested tree. And the amazing thing about southern pine beetle is if you fall that tree, you don't even have to remove it. That will end that bark beetle's life cycle. If only this was the case in mountain pine beetle. And so that's really an ability to be pretty direct with that insect. And then, you know, you're worried about fuel loads and whatnot. You can either chip that tree, wait for those beetles to die, and then be cutting things up for firewood. But probably working with Southern Resources in the Forest Service and Extension. Dave Coyle is an extension specialist out of Georgia, is a really good approach.
Dave's here and he says, we don't use verbenone for southern pine beetle. We use management strategies, i.e. thinning. They work very well. So you're right on with what he's saying. I'm going to ask Mark to launch our polls before too many more people check out of our webinar. We have a couple more questions to address, so please feel free to stick with us, and Jodi will graciously stick around to answer your questions. Blaine asked, what should public land managers, i.e. BLM, Forest Service, National Parks do differently to deal with these pests? Kind of a big question.
Yeah, it is a big question. You know, I really think it comes down to, you know, the question I've been hearing a lot is, why are we getting these big outbreaks of bark beetles? You know, what's changed in the, you know, are we doing something wrong? Is you know, are there predators all gone, etc.? And, you know, that's a complicated answer, but ultimately the eruptive bark beetles, the Dendroctonus groups and the Pinion Ips, they are eruptive bark beetles, and they do have outbreaks. And I think if we try to expect them more, because I think we forget about them. We certainly saw this in British Columbia. Over 10 million acres were wiped, million hectares were wiped out, and people forgot very quickly about the mountain pine beetle after that outbreak subsided. So we need to expect it more. You know, in terms of the climate adaptation side of things, you know, Diana Six is doing some work with the genetics of primarily lodgepole pine and mountain pine beetle. And maybe these insects are helping our forests adapt by killing off the poorly adapted species, the trees that are no longer as well adapted to the current climate conditions as trees that don't die. I think the only answer ultimately for public land managers is to try to bring the public around to the idea of density management. You know, there's a lot of, I think, sort of distrust that thinning is just a way to get at saw log timber, which is not entirely a bad thing. You know, a lot of rural communities would benefit from some level of larger tree extraction. And when I say large tree extraction, I do not mean those massive, beautiful legacy trees, those monsters that were left behind from old gold mining or old logging days. I mean, you know, these sort of moderate, it's not a great way to phrase it, but you know, these trees with sort of 30 centimeter to probably 50 centimeter diameters. Take a few of those out to pay for the much needed thinnings. Think about how we can increase species heterogeneity. California's got a lot of that because of the mixed conifer ecosystems. But in other ecosystems, how can we have more heterogeneity of species? Because these bark beetles are specific. So if you get mountain pine beetle, it wipes out the pine. But you get spruce beetle, it marks out the spruce. If it's some sort of mix, you're not losing everything at once. Probably a bit of a wishy-washy answer, but that's a hard one.
With longer, hotter years occurring, are there going to be multiple generations of mountain pine beetle per year in high elevation areas?
I think in high elevation areas, we're still looking very much at a univoltine life cycle where it takes one full year for the insect to fulfill its life cycle. I think at the lower elevations, that's the big question. And so bark beetle biologists, I think, are really actively looking at that because these insects are very driven by temperature. And the earlier the spring and the later the winter happens, the more activity these bark beetles can have within a single year. And so will we start to see spruce beetle go from a semi-voltine, so taking up 2 years to fulfill its life cycle, to single? Will we start to see mountain pine beetle have more than one generation a year? It's absolutely possible. And I know folks are working on that, which will help us get a sense of that.
What are your thoughts on the use of bark beetle traps to help reduce populations of bark beetles?
Yeah, traps have been actually found to be really ineffective. They're a good way to monitor kind of flight windows and sort of whether kind of your duration and pulses, your peak beetle activity times, but they're not actually effective for reducing the population. It seems like it should be, but they're really a monitoring tool. And I'm always nervous for landowners to use them because those aggregation pheromones, so that pheromones that would attract the beetle, work extremely well. And there's no guarantee that bark beetle is going to hit a trap. You could very easily hit a host tree on the way. So you can really create a problem by concentrating beetles in an area to use those traps.
You mentioned felling a tree to act as a host tree at one point. So what would you do with that tree once it's infested? Would you remove it entirely, I guess, if it was as a host tree?
Yeah, once it's sort of filled up with beetle, then I would be getting rid of that tree. So debarking and burning the bark. You could always keep the tree as firewood, but you'd want to get rid of that bark because the insects are underneath the bark in that sort of phloem cambium layer. So that's the part you want to destroy. You know, ambrosia beetles and whatnot will go actually into the wood, but the Dendroctonus and the Ips will stay in that outer part of the tree. But once that trap has been filled up, then yeah, you want to deal with it you don't want to let it go to the next season. And I've seen that happen. And now you just brought a whole bunch of bark beetles in that then fly out and hit all your green trees. So
okay.
Follow-up action is really important.
Otis asks, are there studies documenting that felling and not dealing with the infested debris is okay for southern pine beetle management?
Yes, there are. So there's a really good, I'm just going to get on my phone so I can find it's a recent synthesis of all the southern pine beetle work that the U.S. Forest Service Region 8 did. And it's 2016 or 2017. And it is by, if I can find my sent mail, I just have to send the reference to somebody. That's why I think I can actually find this. So it's by Colson and Kleepzig. It's 2011. And it's a General Technical Report, SRS 140. So if you go to Region 8, this is a free PDF, and it's a very fulsome, exhaustive, it's 512 pages of how you treat, about the biology, what works and what doesn't. And that's a great resource for southern pine beetle. Great.
Roy asked, I've recently heard that audio confession through the playing of beetle chirps may be helpful in tree protection. Is there any validity to this defense?
So this is a really neat study and patent that just came out. So this is work by Richard Hofstadter at University of Northern Arizona. And he worked with a fellow, like an acoustic specialist, at one of the UC campuses in Santa Cruz. And that's exactly what they did. They piped in music of competing beetles, of their own beetles, into trees. And, you know, it's going to take some further research, but the early research shows that this actually was sort of effective at reducing the amount of infestation levels in trees. Now, again, this is a single tree treatment because they're actually putting these speakers like right kind of in the tree. So you're not just blaring out beetle chirps to the surrounding area. And I spoke with Richard specifically about the study, and the one caveat he had is right now the acoustics only travel so far up the tree. And beetles can attack all the way, they tend to attack all the way to the top until the top is too small for them to like it. And so getting that acoustic signal to propagate up the tree is kind of now the next trick. But I think it's an interesting line of research. And I think what's really cool about it is the acoustic behavior of bark beetles hasn't been really well looked at. And this is if this works as a single tree protection effort, you're not using any chemicals. And I think that would be appealing to a lot of people. So it's research underway, and the early stages show that there is some level of protection offered by this.
Excellent. Brian asked, and I think I'll just have you send me that citation for the SRS 140 publication. And then we'll put that out in our next email blast to everybody. So I think you did an excellent job addressing all of our questions today, and thank you so much for summarizing this very complicated, complex topic. And if you are still with us, please take the poll, the 3-question poll, very quickly. It helps us do our job better and helps me as an extension educator and helps Mark as well. So thanks, Jodi. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.